Thank you. It is a great pleasure to have this opportunity to tell about my empirical research on national identity in the Estonian case. As a context of my research is international affairs, particularly Russian foreign policy, which has become expansionist in recent years, crisis in Ukraine, Georgia, etc., etc. In this context, I argue that the issue of national identity of Russians living in countries around Russia is getting importance. And my second starting point is that current state of affairs in research of national identity is not satisfactory, because if you take mainstream studies on national identity, then you end up with results showing systematically that minorities are deviation from the national norm. My argument is that this is not particularly helpful in current international context, so my talk is very political, in difference as compared to philosophers in this panel. I will conclude with a kind of normative statement, but my point is that normative position is always also political. So my presentation will be divided into three sections. First, Estonian context and theoretical framework. Second, operationalization of national identity along relational theory adopted in this project, and few results just to illustrate what I'm talking, a few empirical results of the case study, and last conclusions. My presentation is based on two lines of research. First, the data I'm using comes from integration monitorings of Estonian society. Estonia has carried out integration monitoring since the year 2000. I have been head of the research team. About 5 years ago, people at the Ministry of Culture invited me over and said that we need a kind of index for national identity, which would be regarded as a basic measure of how integrated Estonian society is. And actually, in this presentation, this measure will be used. The second ground from my project comes from my recent comparative research. It was Russians in Norway and Russians in Estonia, and the relational approach I'm talking about is based on this project. So, and I would like to start with a key message of the whole presentation. My argument is that what we are talking about is asymmetric, interesting field. National identity should be conceptualized and understood in the sociological context of social hierarchies, asymmetries in interesting field between migrants and citizens. And second, and it's a kind of controversial statement, conceptualization of the term national identity in respect of majority group and minority migrant group should be different, and also it should be measured using different instruments. As you see, I already here depart very much from the positivistic mainstream. Just to give few indications of the Estonian context. Here you see ethnic distribution in 3 time spots at the end of the Second World War, when Estonia was ethnically very homogeneous. 97.3% of population was ethnic Estonians. Then 1989, the last population census during Soviet time, when the proportion of migrants increased to 61%, and 2000 census proportion of ethnic Estonians in the population has increased, that it is more or less same also right now. What you see here is a huge demographic change during Soviet period, and a smaller change during independence of Estonia. And next slide, to give you a context of my research, it is acquisition of Estonian citizenship during Estonian independence. You see that in the beginning of 1990s it was very active, but right now it is about 500 in the year, in the context where we have still about 80,000 stateless persons. So right now, Russians in Estonia can be divided into 3 groups in respect of their legal status. A little bit more than half of Estonian Russians have acquired Estonian citizenship. About a quarter are citizens of Russia, and another quarter are stateless persons. So a few words about the theoretical background. What is relationalist paradigm in social sciences? The core idea of relationalism is to overcome a number of social science dualisms between actor, structure, internal, external, etc., etc. It's a kind of field theoretical approach which is gaining importance in very many different social sciences, and in this in the context of this research, I can argue that it plays also a kind of political role, because social science theories are not value neutral; they are politically loaded. If you take objectivist, positivistic theory, you end up with certain types of policy recommendation. If you take a relationalist approach, you end up with different type of policy recommendations. And at the end of my presentation, I would like to conclude why did I choose relationalist approach. So the first question is how to conceptualize national identity. If you take mainstream, positivist mainstream, it is based mostly on psychological approach. And according to this approach, national identity is a sense of belonging to a nation. Now, relationalist approach takes totally different stance, and here I'm referring to Fredrik Barth, a famous Norwegian anthropologist who is a very important figure in social constructivist social sciences. And he said that collective identity is a form of social organization. Collective identity is not belongingness, a kind of subjective phenomena. It is a form of social organization of intergroup relations. So my argument is that relationalism builds and goes beyond what Fredrik Barth and in broader terms interactionist social science says, and I define national identity as social positioning which is taking place in asymmetric interesting field. And the key feature of this interesting field is that we have dominating and dominated subject positions. The idea of asymmetry of interesting field is adopted not only in relational social science, but actually also in mainstream social science. Here I'm referring to John Berry, famous Canadian psychologist, key figure behind the theory of acculturation. And here his definition of integration. If you look on this integration, you see that the idea of asymmetry is built also to this more or less positivistic type of conceptualization of integration. Integration is, on the one hand, non-dominant groups adopt the basic values of the larger society. On the other hand, dominant group adapt its national institutions for the needs of all groups to live together. So here we have two dimensions. One dimension is enculturation, and another dimension is equal opportunities. However, my argument is that if you take mainstream positivistic social science, sociology, political science, etc., dealing with the issue of national identity, then this idea of asymmetry of social field, political field, interethnic field is not used. And here is a kind of typical example of a question related to identity. How do you think of yourself? I think of myself as ethnic, national, as part of another group, etc., etc. This is an example of a positivistic research instrument in which asymmetry of interethnic field is not taken into account. And in my empirical research, which has been also part of integration monitoring of Estonian society for a number of years, my argument here is that national identity of dominating majority and dominated minority groups should be measured along different survey scales, orientations directed either at interethnic hierarchies or interethnic boundaries. And in this context, strong national identity of dominating majority presumes critical orientation towards interethnic hierarchies, and strong identity of dominated minority presumes critical orientations towards interethnic separation. So what I do in this kind of research instrument, I ask different type of questions from majority group and minority group based on the idea of asymmetry of inter-ethnic field. I ask questions which represents a kind of challenge for one or the other part of the society. So, and here is now empirical example from the research how in Estonian integration monitorings we study national identification among Estonian Russians on the one hand and ethnic Estonians on the other hand. There are three questions in both cases, and as you see from Estonian Russians, we ask questions which are related to unity of Estonian state. I feel pride when I see Estonian flag. Estonian state protects my rights and offers public services. And the third one, I think, if you think of yourself as representative of your ethnic group and the Estonian nation, then which group do believe you belong to. So, and answers to all these three questions are given maximum 3 points, depending on the strength of agreement to the statements, and I use both 4-point scale and 5-point scale, and this slide describes the methodology how I define strong, intermediate, and weak national identity. Now I come to the most important section of my presentation, which is now comparisons of strengths of national identification among Estonian Russians and ethnic Estonians. As you saw, I use a very specific instrument. I use different questions in case of ethnic Estonians and in case of Estonian Russians. And my argument is that in studying national identity, you need to take into account the challenges they face. So both face challenges. Estonians are majority, and their challenge is to accept minority. Estonian Russians are minority, and their challenge is to accept Estonian nation state as such. And if you now look on numbers, I differentiate weak, intermediate, and strong national identity. And in the final analysis, I combine intermediate and strong national identity, both for Estonian Russians and ethnic Estonians, and I get more or less the same number for both of these. Even for Russians, the number is somewhat a little bit higher. And I come to a kind of paradoxical result from the point of view of mainstream social science, because we are used to think that, you know, local people, their national identity is higher as compared to migrant population, but here the result is that their national identity is more or less equal. And this kind of reasoning is based on relational approach in social sciences. The argument is that the field where we are operating, it is not equal, and that is why we need to take, if we define the concept of national identity, we need to take into account the challenges both sides are facing. The challenge ethnic Estonians are facing is to receive, to approve, or to agree that Russians are important part of Estonian society, and in case of Russian minority, the challenge is to accept that Estonia is national state. So, and what kind of conclusions can be drawn from this type of empirical case study? The main argument or the reason why I'm doing this type of research is to oppose to mainstream understanding and measuring of national identity, because if you take this mainstream approach, then my argument is that it fails to problematize social hierarchies which exist between majority and minority group, and typical research indicates that national identity of minorities is much lower. This result is interpreted in terms of deviance of minority. And here comes my crucial argument that the phenomena, which is mostly the product of intra-ethnic inequalities, is interpreted in terms of psychological problem of minorities. This is my main main criticism towards the mainstream understanding of national identity, operationalization of national identity. And the normative or political conclusion is that relationalist approach overcomes the ethnocentrism of our conceptualization, our previous conceptualization in measuring and analyzing national identity. Relational approach, the main conclusion from this type of research is that the things are moving in right direction in Estonia. We have ethnic Estonians, we have Estonian Russians. Their views on certain issues are very different. My argument is that it has to be different because we occupy different positions in social hierarchy. And if we are talking about national identity, then national identity means that both sides try to make a step towards each other. And in this context, my argument is that Estonia is moving in right direction. And now, to come back to the start of my presentation, why this type of research is important. I argue that it is important in the context of Russian expansionist foreign policy. If we conceptualize Estonian Russians as deviation from the norm, then we push them towards Russia. And my political argument here is just that it is not very smart thing to do. We need to adopt relational approach, field theoretical approach, which starts from the concept of hierarchy of interethnic relations, and then we try to build up on this concept and figure out how we can diminish hierarchies. We cannot live without hierarchies. Society just does not function without hierarchies, but we have to find ways to diminish negative contexts of social hierarchies. And in the context of Estonian case, in the context of Russian expansionist, my argument is that it makes sense to utilize this kind of social science theory. Thank you very much.